Thank you all for joining. We're going to begin in just a moment. I'm going to give some of our other folks that are logging on now a moment to join us. So we'll begin in about 2 minutes. Hi all, thanks again for logging on. For those of you just joining us, we're going to wait about 1 more minute before we begin the webinar. Well, thank you for all that have joined. We may have some others that join us in the course of the next several minutes, but I would propose, given everyone's, I'm sure, busy schedules, that we go ahead and dive in. My name is Douglas Macaulay. I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I direct the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory, which is an applied research center here at UC Santa Barbara. Thank you for joining our webinar on interactions between fisheries and seabed mining. Before we begin, if I may, just a few housekeeping notes about the webinar methodologies and processes. We're all veterans, I fear, for better or worse, to this format. But our panelists today, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will be those that are sharing audio and video. We absolutely encourage, in fact, the very purpose of the webinar is to have engagement with our research experts and issue area experts. Please do so through the question and answer function at the bottom of the page. There'll be a time reserved towards the end of the webinar in which we'll engage in that Q&A, but please, throughout the course of the webinar, submit your questions so we can have those queued up and ready to share with the experts when we come to that portion of the program. With that out of the way, let me again say thank you for all of those that are joining as attendees, and especially my thanks to our panelists who will share thoughts in just a moment. We're crossing quite a lot of time zones, so I'm especially grateful for everybody's flexibility and for your time in some unusual hours for some of our panelists. One of the missions of the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory is to try to bring science and to try to bring research into conversations that are especially consequential and especially timely in considering important junctures for ocean health. We certainly believe that conversations regarding the development of code and process for the seabed mining conversations meet those search criteria, and so we're glad to bring together some experts in both fisheries community and in the seabed mining, or at least in the deep sea research community together for this webinar. And very happy to serve as the secretariat in that secretariat function of hosting the conversation. The genesis and history of the webinar is simply that we work with quite a number of different fishery management and different fishery organizations in the course of the rest of our portfolio of work, mostly on other issues than seabed mining. And we believe that sustainable fishing is an important part of the future for a blue economy in our oceans. I was a fisherman as a career before I began my career in marine science. And from our colleagues and our network of those in the fishing community, we've received a lot of questions about the subject for this webinar, interactions between fisheries and seabed mining. And so this was what drove us to bring experts together who will have more expertise to share on some of those questions. Some of the questions that run through a quick list that have been raised in our various different interactions and that some of you have submitted our way as seeds for the discussion today include the following. How much overlap is there or will there be between fishing and seabed mining? What are the impacts of wastewater plumes formed by seabed mining in the prey base of tuna fisheries? Will these plumes reduce productivity by impacting this prey base? What toxins are there in wastewater plumes? Will these toxins enter seafood food chains? How will consumer behavior be affected by concerns perceived or real about toxins in tuna from mining wastewater? How will noise and light from seabed mining operations affect tuna behavior? How will fisheries industries claim damage to their industry from the seabed mining industry? How will increased water turbidity, reduced light, and reduced oxygen affect tuna and tuna prey bases? There's, I'm sure, many other questions, and the whole purpose is for you to submit the questions that are most important to you and the groups that you represent. So I simply submit those as core questions that we've already put in front of our panelists and will derive at least the start of our conversation. One thing we recognize is that all of you represent a little bit of a diversity of different expertise with seabed mining, with some folks on the call being experts in the policy of seabed mining and the science of seabed mining in our attendee audience, and others approaching the issue for the first time. We're going to focus our conversation at more of a basic level, but then when we get to the opportunity to get to the question and answer section of the webinar, that will be your chance for those that are more expert to drill down and get into more advanced topics with their experts. So with the goal of keeping us on track and providing more bandwidth and time here for our experts, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker for today, Mr. Alexander Rodriguez. And Mr. Rodriguez serves as the Executive Secretary of the EU Long Distance Fleet Advisory Council, or LDAC. Mr. Rodriguez has been, as I understand it, one of the most engaged the fishery management specialists and experts thus far in the International Seabed Authority, so we're grateful to have that expertise brought into the conversation. Mr. Rodriguez's first degree was in law and economics from Vigo University in Spain, master cum laude in European law by the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and a PhD in specialization of international public law and fisheries policy in the University of Coruña, Spain. And Mr. Rodriguez, I will pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me well. So, well, good afternoon to our participants from America. Good evening to all of us who are in Europe and also the African continent, and good morning for the other parts of the world, Asia, Oceania in particular. So my name is Alexandre. I'm the Executive Secretary of the EU Long Distance Fisheries Advisory Council. This is one of the 12 advisory bodies that exist in Europe on fisheries. Our role is to gather all the fisheries stakeholders who have a legitimate interest in the policy making on fisheries, and also provide technical expertise to our clients, so to speak, are the European Commission and the EU member states. And the long distance, particularly, as you can imagine, it basically deals with all the waters except the European one. So basically the whole world, the external dimension of the common fisheries policy. So one of our fields of interest is obviously international ocean governance, and also the impact of activities on fisheries such as deep sea mining. Just to make it very clear for those who are not familiar with our work, we are not a lobby. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we have both representatives from the fishing industry, fishing sector in general, like importers, traders, processors, trade unions, but also environmental NGOs and other groups of interest. And we work in a spirit of consensus, and most of our advice are evidence-based and they are not political. So we have a sort of neutral, arbitral role here, and we are not lobbying for any specific interest. It is a great pleasure to be here today. I'll try to keep it my reflections at the basic level, because I think there is a mixed audience. I'll do my best to summarize the work we have done. So there are 3 advisory councils that have joined forces, the long distance, the pelagic species, and the northwestern waters. And we published a year ago a very thorough advice on this topic specifically. And we will continue. We have started, in fact, we did another one in 2019, and we hope to have another one by the first half of this year, because as you know, many of you, like the political developments have been very substantial in the last year, and there's been a lot of countries doing public statements in the International Ocean Governance Fora. Okay, so in our advice, we have made a considerable effort in mapping the state of scientific knowledge available, the legal framework, and the resolutions that has been done in this field of the international ocean governance, and also have looked at a few research papers on the impacts of deep sea mining in fishing activities. There is not much evidence yet, because obviously there is no exploitation contracts yet as such, but we have already noticed some indirect affectations, let's say, to some fishing activities. And then we have also included some considerations about circular economy, if it's needed in the first place to have a deep sea mining activities for certain minerals, or we can simply use alternative sources, or just to reduce consumption of some goods. So we have made some reflections on that. So I want to convey with you, because I only have 8 minutes and I think I'm already 5 minutes left, 3 core ideas. The first idea is science should be always the driving force of the process. We have made it very clear in our advice. There is no need to rush on moving towards an exploitation of the deep sea mining. We are in the UN Decade of Marine Science. It's very important to understand the potential impacts of deep sea mining in the environment before causing any irreversible or significant damage to the key benthic features, only for the sake of short-term economic gain. Again, let's remember that the general interest of humankind must prevail over particular interest of public or private contractors, even if sponsored by states. And we need time again to process environmental deep sea data and carry out robust environmental impact assessments, and through a peer review process, of course. So my first message is we need to put scientists and environmental experts at the heart of the policy shaping. This approach needs to be done in 2 dimensions. One would be the case-by-case basis of the areas affected, and the other one would be at a regional approach with the regional environmental management plans, the known as REMPs. That is a process that has been already agreed by the International Seabed Authority. Also, finally, on this point, the implementation of a precautionary approach framework and clear conservation measures to protect biodiversity needs to be implemented also before exploitation contracts are awarded. We have a lot of examples in the high seas, in fisheries, in the RFMOs, in the regional fisheries management organizations, where we have precautionary approach frameworks and a mechanism where there is a lack of robust environmental data to provide advice. And also there is many examples on designations of vulnerable marine ecosystems in the high seas in areas, for example, of NAFO or NIAF COSPAR in the Atlantic, for example. The second idea I want to pass to you is we must follow, obviously, that's an obvious thing, but we have to remember we must follow the mandates provided by UNCLOS and comply with the general principles and instrument of public international law. That means that, of course, we support that ISA, the International Seabed Authority, finalize their mandates that has been established under UNCLOS at international level, and I think Diva will explain a bit more about that, so I will not go into that. But there is a number of articles which guarantees that there needs to be necessary measures to make sure that the marine environment is not harmed by these activities before doing anything else. So we can mention that on the questions and answer. I can be more specific. I'm thinking about articles such as 145 or 154, but we can discuss of this later. And then again, clear and objective rules needs to be done for a pre-assessment of the work plans that are presented by potential contractors, and there needs to be an effective compliance procedure for monitoring implementation. That should be prerequisites, and that shouldn't be done after. And the third and final idea I want to convey to you is there's been already some publications, as I say before, on the impact of deep sea mining, potential impacts in fishing activities. There is a recent scientific paper published by Van Dorn that talks about the different types of uncertainties we are dealing with. not only scientific, but geopolitical, economic, societal, and cultural. And there are direct impacts on fishing, such as displacement, proximity to fishing grounds, or overlap of areas, as Dr. Douglas have mentioned, which will cause direct effort displacement. I'm thinking in areas of the Eastern and Northwestern Pacific, Western Indian Ocean, and Mid-Atlantic Ridge. For fishing grounds for pelagic and mesopelagic species. Indirect impact, again, I think the scientists will present it later. It's due to anthropogenic noise or pollution by plumes of sediment spread in the water column. And there are also a recent study, Marine Policy describes potential spatial intersections for high sea fisheries for 3 species of tunas. So that's what we are a bit concerned, because we have a lot of members fishing in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and already have noticed some displacement of fishing migrations due to, for example, oil and gas platforms because of the activity. So that could be a bit of a parallel with the deep sea mining in this case. So final considerations and demands. We, the advisory councils concerned, have pleaded for either for a prohibition or at least for a precautionary pause on the exploitation by the ISA of marine minerals in the international seabed area before the effects of deep sea mining are sufficiently known on the environment and biodiversity, and the risks are properly understood, and technologies and operational practices are able to demonstrate no serious harm to the environment. About the circular economy, yeah, we promote implementation of strategies and measures to allow to move from society from a linear throwaway economy to a circular economy, in line with the 4 R's of sustainable living: refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. So just finally, as a final remark, we are in a crucial stage now in the field of international ocean governance. The conclusion of the mining code is expected to be between this year, ideal, or maybe next year. So we need to act with being many of us have been already present during many years. The mineral resources of the seafloor in the area are the common heritage of humankind. Precautionary approach and public interest for a common good must prevail over individual commercial interests from private companies. And then there needs to be a rigorous and transparent model of regulations. So there is environmental impact assessments again. So just for ending with a bit of a more light note, this Christmas, I went to see Avatar, as many people, and I just took note of the very last line of the movie, which is very revealing when talking about preserving natural resources in Pandora, in the planet. It says, "This is our home, this is our fortress, this is where we stand." So I think this is a message we can have in our brains when discussing this topic. Thank you very much, and sorry if I have exceeded a bit my time.
No, thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Very appropriate to open with, appropriate message to close with. We appreciate the perspective from the EU Long Distance Fleet Advisory Council. I should note that Mr. Rodriguez contributes a great deal of policy expertise and legal expertise, but we do also have a number of other marine policy experts that are here to support the panel should any of our attendees wish to have a deeper dive conversation during the question and answer about matters of policy. I will again invite folks that wish to submit a question to please do so as we move forward in the question and answers. From here, we're going to segue. We'll hold those questions at the end, and we'll segue to 3 speakers from the scientific community. We're going to begin next with Dr. Diva Aman. Dr. Aman is a deep sea biologist, has a master's in marine biology from the University of Southampton, has conducted over 15 research expeditions exploring and doing science in the deep sea. She did her postdoctoral work at the University of Hawaii and the Natural History Museum of London. And Dr. Aman, you've won too many awards for me to summarize here. I chose simply 2 from your CV. Recently named the Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, and won some years back International Seabed Award from the Secretary General for Excellence in Deep Sea Research. Dr. Aman has kindly offered to give us a bit of a baseline review of the state of play in seabed mining from the perspective of science. And Diva, I pass the floor to you.
Many thanks for that kind introduction, Doug, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming today. So today, as Doug mentioned, I'm going to try to give you a whistle-stop tour of deep sea mining, including, what it is, the policy and decision-making landscape, the state of the science, and end with the growing political shift that is happening. So specifically, I'm going to stay away from the links to fisheries, as Jeff and Yessa, who you're going to hear about a little bit later on, will discuss that in detail. See if I can get this to work. Ooh. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview of the industry. And well, these are the four main components that I'm going to cover, and we're going to start with an overview of the industry. So there's really been global interest that has waxed and waned in this emerging industry, deep sea mining, since the 1960s. And, that's largely been because of global metal demand doing that waxing and waning, which is a key motivation. There are three main resource types that are being sought after as part of this industry. The first is polymetallic nodules, which you can see in the picture on the left. Second is seafloor massive sulfides in the middle picture. The third, cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts on the right. And these have various minerals within them, but mostly being sought after for nickel, cobalt, manganese, rare earth elements, gold and silver, and so on. And they all occur in various different settings in the deep sea, and have various different fauna inhabiting these environments. And so this is a quick schematic of, what are we talking about when we mention deep sea mining? And so here we can see it's basically the gathering of minerals from the deep sea floor. Here we can see there's going to be a basic machine that moves along the deep sea floor, actually doing the mining. This particular example we can see here is the mining of polymetallic nodules, which you can see are the black dots. And so once that machine moves along the seafloor collecting the nodules, that will then be sucked up by this riser pipe you can see here. And that'll be a mixture of nodules and sediment and seawater. And that's going to go to a ship, which is waiting above, where these nodules are going to be separated from the sediment and the seawater. And then there are waste, sediment, and seawater, which could be mixed with some remaining nodule pieces, will then be pumped back into the ocean at a depth which is not yet determined, but hopefully will be soon. And as you can tell, this is going to cause some damage to the marine environment, which we will talk about shortly. And so it's really important to note that what you saw in the video, as we heard from Alex already today, that mining, there's no full-scale seabed mining happening yet. Currently, what is occurring in areas beyond national jurisdictions or international waters is that there have been 31 exploration contracts issued by the International Seabed Authority. The ISA is the governing body of minerals in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and they have a dual mandate to manage seabed mining as well as protect the marine environment from these activities. And so the key area where many of these contracts have been granted is an area known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which you can see in the map on the bottom right. And each of those colored blocks are areas where these contracts have been granted. The yellow have not yet been granted or are reserved. And then the areas labeled as APIs are areas of particular environmental interest or protected areas as deemed by the International Seabed Authority. And so who have these contracts been granted to? Well, most of the contractors range from state entities to state research institutes to some private sector companies as well, and involves countries such as, Germany, France, Korea, Japan, all the way down to Nauru, Kiribati, the Cook Islands, and Tonga. And these ISA contracts run for 15 years, though they can be extended. They can apply for that. And most of these contracts are in the process of gathering environmental baseline data and testing small-scale prototype machines, which we'll hear a little bit about shortly. And there's been a big shift in this emerging industry, in that in 2021, the Nauru-sponsored ISA contractor Nauru Ocean Resources Inc., has essentially triggered a 2-year rule and indicated their intention to apply to mine nodules in 2023. And this has really accelerated the entire industry, which we'll talk again a little bit about shortly. So that was in international waters, but this is also a concern within exclusive economic zones of countries. There have been seafloor massive sulfide licenses granted in Papua New Guinea, as well as the Red Sea, although neither has been pursued. And in fact, the Papua New Guinea venture did end in the company, sorry, essentially becoming bankrupt, and Papua New Guinea was left out of pocket for several hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of that failed attempt to mine. But there's also some exploration going on in other countries, for instance, the Cook Islands here, which we can see the EEZ on the left, and some of the plans for the spatial management there, as well as in Japan and Norway. And so in the midst of this, the science has also been really rapidly gathering pace about the ocean and the deep ocean. It's grown remarkably. And science has really been showing us a lot of different things. We know that the ocean is more than 70% of the planet's surface, with the high seas at about 40%. So this is not an insignificant part of the planet. We know that there are between 700,000 and 1 million species found in the ocean, most of these undiscovered and in the deep sea. There's been far less than 1% of the deep sea ever seen with human eyes or a camera. And we've also learned a lot more about some of these areas where mining contracts have been granted. For instance, in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, CCZ nodule field, we know that 70 to 90% of the species collected there are new to science, and about half of the large species are attached to the nodules themselves. At hydrothermal vents, we know that globally, these make up just 50 square kilometers of ocean, and over 80% of the named species live only there. And at seamounts, like we can see here in this photo, we know that they're often home to what we term rainforests of the deep, with some sponges and corals that are thousands of years old, and as many of you know, where there are key links to fisheries. And science is also showing us that there will be a range of impacts from deep seabed mining. So projected intensities and methodologies of deep seabed mining, as well as the scale of what we're talking about, means that deep sea mining would cause some pretty significant environmental impacts at some of the most pristine habitats on the planet. And these will include direct removal and destruction of the seafloor habitats, along with their unique fauna by that machine that moves along the seafloor. And we'll also see sediment plumes created from that seafloor disturbance, as well as the return of the sediment-laden wastewater that will then extend the impacts of deep sea mining horizontally and vertically for tens to hundreds of kilometers. And as we heard already from Alex, there's also going to be contaminant release, changes to water properties, and very real increases in noise and light that many of the animals inhabiting these areas would never have been exposed to. And these impacts from mining might be considered inconsequential on quite small scales, but actually the scales of the potential disturbance here are enormous. We know that, for instance, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, where there's the most activity currently, that stretches from Hawaii to Kiribati to Mexico. And some of the industry projections there are to directly mine seafloor habitats of about 500 square kilometers. And when you consider that the ocean is, of course, three-dimensional and there'll be plume and noise pollution, that will at least triple the aerial impact to about 1.5 cubic kilometers, yes. No, kilometers squared, yielding a footprint that's roughly the size of Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, and Germany, as you can see here. And when you again consider that three-dimensional volume, we then know that that's probably going to be about 6 million kilometers cubed of ocean, considering that the water column is about 4,500 meters high. And so, as mentioned earlier, contractors are doing baseline surveys of the areas that they've been granted, but ultimately that's of varying quality, quantity, and accessibility to that science. And there's also some independent deep sea science going on in each of these areas. And more recently, there have been several tests underdone. So Global Sea Mineral Resources, so GSR, which is the Belgian contractor, undertook as well as BGR, the German contractor, they undertook a small scale prototype test a few years ago. And then just last year, the metals company and Nori, the Nauru contractor, trialed its prototype machine in the CCZ. And from all of this, we know that our scientific knowledge is slowly increasing, but the gaps still dominate. So I led a study last year, which some on the call were part of, and that mentioned that it found that, just 1.1% of scientific categories assessed across the regions where there are mining licenses had enough scientific knowledge to enable evidence-based management. And for the Clarion-Clipperton zone, that was just a smidge more. At 15% of categories assessed had enough scientific knowledge to enable evidence-based management. So what we can conclude, that's what you can see here in this graph on the corner, and what you're really looking for there is very dark colors indicating complete knowledge. And so as you can see, instead of there being the dark green color, there's mostly white, which indicates that there's no or next to no scientific knowledge. So really, there's still a lot more that we need to do to understand these environments, as well as how they might be impacted by this new industry. And so when we think about governance, this is another fascinating area, but one that is still quite some way from being ready to be a functional governing institution. So we know that the mineral resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction are deemed to be the common heritage of humankind. That means that the benefits of them should be shared between you and I, everyone on the planet, and all generations yet to come. So not an easy thing to manage. And the International Seabed Authority, which is made up of several different bodies here, which you can see in this figure. We have the Assembly, 167 states, the Council, which is the decision-making body, 36 states, the Legal and Technical Commission, which is comprised of 41 experts, the Finance Committee, as well as the ISS Secretariat, which is charged with really managing this entire industry. They set the rules and, with the sponsoring state, oversee compliance in the area and on behalf of humankind. And as we heard, currently there are only exploration regulations in place for existing contracts, and these are quite light touch and rely a lot on contractor self-reporting, which is not ideal. And then right now, which has been happening since 2014, there's been a lot of work on the exploitation regime, with draft regulations text working through several working groups. These are everything from the financial matters to protection of the marine environment, institutional matters, and inspection, compliance, and enforcement. And this process, as you can see, it's been going on since 2014, is very slow moving. This is not an easy political negotiation, and there's a lot of difficulty in aligning the diversity of views. This entire process has been made even more challenging with the triggering of this 2-year rule by Nauru. Now, the 2-year rule provision found in the 1994 agreement was inserted to prevent a situation where there was a deadlock in the negotiations of the regulations for exploitation, which must be adopted by consensus. Again, not an easy thing. And so in other words, if there was one single objection at the council, that would prevent the regulations from being adopted. And so under normal circumstances, if the regulations were not in place, the ISA would not be able to consider mining applications. And so this said provision, the 2-year trigger, allows any member state to submit a request that the exploitation regulations be adopted within 2 years and provide a way out if there was such an impasse. And so this is what Nauru has done. It's invoked the provision in 2021. And that means that the so-called deadline expires in less than a year, so in July 2023. But unfortunately, there are still several, apart from the fact the exploitation regulations are really still not close to being finished, there are also several other major issues outstanding, as you can see here. This is everything from EIA procedures under exploration to the regional environmental management plans, to equitable benefit sharing, data management, stakeholder engagement, and so on. There's still a lot more to do. And in the last few years, this has all been happening at the same time as in the last few years, there's been this accelerating political shift. And so we've seen a number of civil society organizations, including the Pacific Blue Line and the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, really stepping up to say, hey, we don't think mining should be happening, especially on the time frame in which many would like it to, some would like it to. We've seen scientists come forward, over 650 scientists from 44 countries, call us asking for a pause to the transition from exploration to exploitation. We've seen a number of financial organizations, from banks like Lloyd's, NatWest, Credit Suisse, investment firms from Goodlander to Generation, and even the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, UNFFI, release a report last year saying, in their current form, there is no foreseeable way in which the financing of deep sea mining activities can be viewed as consistent with sustainable blue economy finance principles. So there's been a number of key stakeholder groups that are actively speaking out. And that's also not limited to manufacturers. We've seen Google, you can see at the bottom, Google, Patagonia, BMW, Volkswagen, a number of users of these potential minerals coming out and saying, we will not source minerals from the deep sea unless or until it is proven that this does not have does not cause harm to the marine environment. And in addition to that shift, we've also seen a number of parliamentarians step forward, including the Pacific Parliamentarians Alliance on Deep Sea Mining, launched last year. The Global Parliamentary Declaration calling for a moratorium on deep seabed mining, also launched last year at the UN Ocean Conference. And probably most significantly is that we've seen a number of governments stepping forward and also opposing this transition from exploration to exploitation. That has included a number of bans within countries' waters, for instance, Fiji, Palau, several US states, Australia's Northern Territory. And then again, last year we saw the Alliance of Countries calling for a deep sea mining moratorium launched at the UN Ocean Conference. And at that time, it was Fiji, Palau, and Samoa that were part of that. And since then, as you can see in this diagram, we've had a number of other countries, in fact, 12 other countries that have publicly called for a slowdown to the transition to exploitation, despite the 2-year trigger. So really, there does seem to be some growing opposition from, well, within all stakeholder groups, including states, emerging. So I know that's a lot of information. You probably have questions, and we'll save those until the end. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to discussing further with you at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amen. And indeed, a lot of food for thought for all of us, and a very robust and rigorous overview. We appreciate that. And again, acknowledge that many people are approaching this from different levels. And for those who just joined, we will have an opportunity in the question and answer to explore more of the basics or dig into some more advanced concepts in the question and answer. So please do submit any questions you have using that function at the bottom of the webinar. I want to turn now to our next speaker, Professor Jeff Drazen. Dr. Drazen is a professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dr. Drazen has obtained his PhD at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography and did his postdoctoral work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Dr. Drazen is a leading expert on many things having to do with the deep ocean, including interactions between fish and seabed mining, as well as interactions between pelagic food webs and new considerations about seabed mining. Certainly a lot known and a lot unknown as well. Dr. Drazen, I will turn the floor to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Doug, for the introduction, and thanks to Neil as well for organizing this, and the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory for organizing this webinar and inviting me. Let me get started here. Okay, well, it falls to me to introduce to you, if you're not already aware, some of the environmental risks of deep seabed mining, particularly in the context of fisheries. So what we're going to, I think Deep has already given a really good overview of the mining itself. The demand for metals is increasing. A lot of this is due to the need for batteries to decarbonize our economies and our energy systems. and current batteries use a lot of metals. We've got 3 different resource types that are being sought after. Hydrothermal vents are pictured on the left. Seamounts are pictured in the middle. Abyssal plains are pictured on the right. And these mineral resources take hundreds of thousands to millions of years to form in these systems, which will become important when I talk about recovery. This is a map showing the distribution of possible resources across the world ocean. It is perhaps a bit optimistic in where actual economically viable deposits may exist. But in red, you'll see along the axes of ocean spreading centers, the massive sulfide deposit areas. And in blue, you'll see abyssal plain regions that have nodules, and in yellow, you'll see regions that have seamounts. And I want to call your attention to a couple of these locales. So in yellow here is the prime, and PCZ is the prime crust zone. This is a portion of the world's ocean basin that is the oldest. It has the oldest seamounts in the world. And so they've had the most time to accumulate these crusts of metals, which include things like cobalt and nickel. And so areas around the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, even the Philippines and Solomon Islands, all have these very old seamounts that are of particular interest to mining entities. If we take a look at the nodules, and this is where we expect deep sea mining to occur first on the high seas, we have the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. This is a region between Hawaii, where I am, and Central America. And these have a great density of nodules with high metal content. Another area of great interest in the South Pacific is the Penrhyn Basin. So the metals are distributed in many different areas, and I think Dr. Vandergreent in the future presentation is going to show you where all the exploration licenses have occurred. I'll show you a quick slide too, but there's interest potentially very widespread. The scale of this mining is potentially huge. Dr. Rahman has already alluded to this. These are the license areas in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. There's 19 shown in these brown polygons, and when superimposed across the continental United States, this spans an area from California to Pennsylvania or upstate New York. It's really large. I won't focus too much on potential environmental risks to deep seafloor communities. But I will talk about it just briefly and how it may relate to fisheries. The studies that have been done, and some of those, particularly in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, started a couple of decades ago, and we have discovered that the resilience of these seafloor communities is very low. The deep sea is cold, the current speeds are slow, there's very high pressure, the pace of life down there is very slow. On the bottom right image, you'll see an example of one of these experiments that were conducted by scientists to evaluate the effects of deep sea mining on the seafloor. And this was just a dredge track to simulate mining, and it's a couple meters wide. And if you look carefully, you'll see the edges are quite crumbly, and it looks like this dredge was just drawn across the seafloor recently. This picture was actually taken 26 years after this has occurred. These systems don't recover quickly at all, and we expect that full recovery of ecosystems is going to take well in excess of 100 years, and for quite a bit of the fauna, it will not occur. As you see in the middle picture, or on the picture on the left, there's a host of animals that live on the mineral resources themselves, whether those be sulfide deposits at vents or nodules on the abyssal plain. And so those are the resource that is that habitat, which is going to be removed by mining. So studies have suggested that there will undoubtedly be some level of species and biodiversity loss as a result of large-scale seafloor mining. In addition, we rely on these seafloor ecosystems to regenerate nutrients in the ocean and to sequester carbon out of the ocean atmosphere cycle over long-term time periods, and those ecosystem functions are likely to be changed due to large-scale deep-sea mining. So those are seafloor potential risks, environmental risks. And of course, those can matter because we do have deep sea fisheries, as all of you, I'm sure, are well aware. We fish on seamounts, continental margins, in the open ocean, and frequently down to depths of about 1,200 meters. I picture on the left an orange roughy, which is captured on seamounts throughout the Pacific, particularly the South Pacific, Indian, and also the North Atlantic. And it's fished from 300 to about 1,200 meters. Grenadiers are in the middle. They live from anywhere from several hundred meters down to maybe 2,000 meters, and can be exploited between about 800 and 2,000 meters in a number of ocean basins. And on the right, we have the opa, which is an open ocean fish, which is actually quite deep living. It lives between 100 to 1,000 meters, where it's also captured as typically as bycatch in tuna longline fisheries, though it is a very tasty animal. And so in particular, I think there is concern that these seafloor impacts will affect seamounts in the fisheries that they host. But there's also indirect effects that are likely to occur. And that's because many of our open ocean fisheries are connected to the deep sea through food webs. So this picture here is a food web diagram. And the animals you see now are those that we target in our fisheries. They include things like this big-eyed tuna and this swordfish. And if we look at the rest of the food web here, the surface food web is illustrated on the top of the diagram, and it begins with phytoplankton, which use sunlight and carbon dioxide, moves to zooplankton, small fishes, and then our target species in fisheries. And many of these plankton and small fishes and squids and shrimps, they migrate vertically on a daily basis. This is the single largest migration of animals on Earth. Many of these small squid and shrimp and fishes will reside down in the dark, down to depths of 1,000 meters, occasionally a bit more during the day. They're there because they're hiding from all our target species, from things like tunas that are visual predators and can see them in the brightly lit surface waters during the day. But all of these animals return towards the surface at night under cover of darkness because there's more food resources for them in the surface ocean. Interestingly, this is a big arms race. Animals like big-eyed tuna have evolved the capacity to dive to 600 meters to feed. Swordfish dive to 1,000 meters to feed on deep-sea squids. So the point of this diagram is to illustrate that the ocean is vertically connected and that we can't think of it as discrete shallow water systems from which we gather many of our food resources and deep sea systems. They're actually coupled together. So what affects one is likely to affect the other. And if we take a look at this mining technology again, and we look at the potential for midwater impacts, then these connections become more clear. This diagram shows in the foreground an abyssal plain habitat, which is well below the depths of any current fishing practice. And a collector vehicle here will create a plume of mud behind it, and it will also shoot ore along with sediment, mud, and unwanted seawater up a pipe to a surface ship where it will be separated. But the unwanted mud and seawater will be discharged back into the ocean. That likely won't be discharged into the surface ocean, but a number of companies are talking about discharging it at about 1,000 meters depth. Other companies are actually talking about bringing it all the way back down to the seafloor, but it is mixed and there is no regulation as to where the discharge should or could occur. So the problem of this then is that from indirect impact perspective is that the pumping mechanisms and the bringing of ore to the surface ship is going to be tremendously noisy. And of course, we have these large sediment plumes. It's estimated that one mining operator would create about 50,000 cubic meters per day of muddy seawater. To give you a sense of perspective, a 20-foot shipping container holds 50 cubic meters roughly. So this is about 1,000 20-foot shipping containers per day of mud discharged into the deep midwaters. That will come with the mud, but also a lot of the ore material will be broken up as it comes up these pipes. And so there's going to be a lot of surface area of metal. Nodules are not hard rocks, but they're actually rather fragile, and so are some of these sulfide deposits. So these metals will then go into solution, and in addition to the mud, there will be dissolved metals entering the water column. How big are these plumes? Well, that's a great question, and we have a little bit of data now because a couple of companies have tested mining vehicles. These are typically, well, they have not yet been full-scale, full-size mining vehicles. And so we've got a little bit of data to inform plume modeling efforts. These are studies which predict the extent of these plumes, and our best models suggest that these plumes will move between 10 and 50 kilometers away from the site of creation, and that they could influence between 1,500 and 3,000 cubic kilometers per year. So these are not small. What will happen to the midwater communities and thus to our fisheries? Well, noise will affect marine mammals and other fauna. It may change their habitat use, their migration patterns, as Alex was informing us with current interactions between some fish species and the oil and gas industry. There could be respiratory distress from clogged gills. The mud in the water column could clog the gills of different animals. There are species like this copepod pictured on the top and this gelatinous animal called a larvation here on the bottom, which builds this beautiful mucus house. These animals are at the base of midwater food webs. They filter out small organic particles from the water column, but now they'll need to contend with a large volume of inorganic mud particles, and that may clog their filtering apparatuses, dilute their food supply, and these animals are kind of the base of the food web. Mud may settle on the bells of jellies, causing buoyancy issues, and there's a lot of gelatinous organisms in these deep midwaters that are important for the functioning of that system. And you don't have to pay attention to the details of this figure, but as I mentioned before, there's concern over the toxicity of the metals that will be released. Copper, cadmium, cobalt are all going to be potentially released from nodule or cobalt seamount crust mining, and metals including zinc and mercury might be released from sulfide mining. So in addition, the mud may impair visual communication, and that's really important in the deep midwaters. This animal, bizarre animal, is called a spookfish or a barrel eye, and you can see its tremendously well-developed eyes, and they are often looking for bioluminescence. This is a dragonfish. You're looking at its belly. It has lights under its eyes, on its fins, and along its belly. Many animals in these deep midwaters have incredible visual capabilities, and they also use bioluminescence to communicate with one another, and mud will interfere with all of this visual interactions, and that includes finding mates and capturing prey. So when we consider these individual effects, which are listed in this table on the left, and we sum them amongst all the individuals that could be affected by these plumes, and you can imagine the midwater community on the left of this diagram and our commercially important species on the right of this diagram. When we add up all these individual effects, they may change the composition of the communities of prey for commercially important species. They may cause the emigration of more mobile taxa away from the sites of mining. They may cause the death of certain prey populations or decrease their fitness and production potential. So this is how there may be links to commercial fisheries in indirect pathways, other than direct mining in some of the benthic habitats where some, for instance, seamount fisheries occur. This discharge of mud into the water column could affect fisheries much more broadly. And it's not just through the hampering of their habitat and prey populations, but there's also concerns that the release of these toxic metals could make their way through the food web and into our seafood supply chains. This figure here shows mercury concentration in a natural setting. This is not related to mining, but this is a natural setting in the Central Pacific. And this mercury concentration is on a log scale here on the left. And this axis on the bottom is their median depth of where they forage in the water column. So you have very shallow dwelling foraging fishes like mahi-mahi on the left, and you have very deep foraging fishes like swordfish on the right. And the concentrations of mercury in these animals have already been adjusted for bioaccumulation, the differences in age and size of the fish. And you can see that even after that, the deepest living species have the highest mercury concentrations. Now, this is just naturally occurs. And we have discovered and I mean we by the scientific community, not me personally, but I've been involved in this research, and we've found that the mercury that enters the ocean is preferentially transformed by bacteria in these deep midwaters. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, the bacteria that live in these midwater systems do a very good job of making mercury bioavailable. And when it is bioavailable, that mercury then enters these food webs. So any organism that's diving into those depths and partaking in those organisms as a food resource, they have high mercury concentration. If this occurs naturally, what will happen when we add a lot of metals from the mining industry into these ecosystems? There is the potential for these metals to enter the seafood supply. So this is a map showing all of the RFMOs for tuna, for pelagic fisheries, and all of the colored circles are existing exploration license areas issued by the ISA. So you can see that most of the RFMOs in the world already do have some intersection with this nascent mining industry. And there's also a lot of interest in mining within countries' exclusive economic zones, and this is particularly true in the Pacific. And so I've just illustrated here a figure from a recent paper which shows a number of different Pacific Island nations and the access fees that they generate from their fisheries and the percentage of government revenue that that represents. So it's just to illustrate that there are many nations, and this is just a Pacific example, that rely extensively on their fisheries, and there is a potential interaction between deep sea mining and those fisheries. So where do we go from here? Well, some closing thoughts for you. Right now, there is one midwater ecosystem study ongoing in a mining area. That's in the Eastern CCZ, a region called NORI-D. That study is in process. I'm the lead of that study along with a variety of other scientists, but it's the only one so far. So it's great that it started, but we certainly need more. There are indeed a lot of unknowns for deep sea mining technology and its environmental risks. And as Dr. Aman illustrated, knowledge gaps still predominate in this arena. I think we need to consider the relative environmental consequences of terrestrial and deep sea mining. There is a big push for metals, that's without a doubt, until we can generate better batteries that maybe don't need as many of them. But do we need to mine in the deep sea? I think that is a fair question. And it's very important to involve all stakeholders in decision-making, both at the ISA level and at individual nation level. And that's why I was quite excited to be invited to this webinar today to speak to all of you so that we can get a more diverse audience involved in the actual decision-making behind regulations and policies around deep sea mining. So I'll just end by saying thank you for your attention. Thanks to many colleagues and fellow scientists who have helped us in our studies along the way. And thanks once again to Benioff and to Doug, Neil, and others who helped organize this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Drazen. Much appreciated. Thank you for the work, and thank you for taking the time out to share at least the preliminary results and what you know of the field here. These questions that we floated at the start that are coming from industry and our colleagues in fisheries are certainly those that you can speak directly to, as can other panelists. So grateful for you sharing that perspective. I'd like to move from here, from Dr. Drazen to Dr. Jesse van der Grient. Dr. van der Grient is with now the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute. Dr. van der Grient obtained her PhD at University of Oxford, where she worked on deep sea benthic communities, and did her postdoc work at University of Hawaii, doing quite a number of different important research reports, including the first quantitative study assessing overlap between seabed mining, wastewater plumes, and fisheries. Dr. van der Grient, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction. Just gonna share my slides. Okay, now thank you all for coming here. I'm really excited to tell you about my research on the overlap of deep seabed mining areas and fisheries in the high seas. As already Dr. Dresen detailed, the deep sea mining can potentially impact high seas fisheries in different ways. Our species of commercial interest, such as tunas and billfishes, do prey on mesopelagic species that are present in 200 to 1,000 meters depth. Either deep sea mining can directly impact our commercial species or indirectly via impacts on the mesopelagic. That will depend on what kind of deposit that is going to be mined and where. So reduced food availability obviously can result in fewer commercial species that can influence what will end up on our plate. But like Dr. Dresen also explained, there's a potential bioaccumulation of metals that are released during the mining collection process. In addition, the other stresses like noise, as well as the dewatering or the discharge plume that can spread, it might mean that species move out of the area, that they avoid the area. Maybe we'll see some changes in distributions. Maybe we'll see altering migration patterns, but this is still not sure. And like we've heard from Dr. Aman and from Dr. Dresen, there's a lot of things that we're still not sure. There's a lot of gaps on it. But we really want to have the high seas fisheries on board in this discussion, as the high seas fisheries are a potential stakeholder. And there's definitely a first step that we can do, and that is that spatial analysis that I'm going to talk about. So the first step to see if there is potential for conflict between these two industries is to see whether there's overlap and how much. Now, overlap is defined, that I define it here as the percentage that is fished in these licensed areas that we've been talking about, that is made up for the RFMO areas. So I'll be talking about tuna RFMOs, data sets that I've been working with are from tuna fisheries. And I've highlighted here, you've already seen this figure, the 5 different tuna RFMOs, as well as the different licensed areas. While these 3 different deposit types require different technologies to mine, there are similarities in the impact. So we will see noise pollution, we will see light pollution, and there will be suspended sediment in the mid-water as well as on the sea floor. So we can, as a first pass, assume that the impacts will be, in that case, similar, and therefore we can do this consistent analysis. So we're interested in to see what percentage do these licensed mining areas contribute to RFMO catches. And I'm presenting on comparisons just for the mining areas and the RFMOs. We're looking at different spatial extents because the impact of the different stressors, of the discharge plumes, of the noise pollution can vary, and we're still not entirely sure how that's going to spread. So for example, the discharge plume spread will depend on, for example, how deep it's being released, what the regional oceanography conditions are like, what kind of sediment particle size there is. So there's a lot of questions we still don't know, and it's difficult to predict how it might go. I'm also presenting on how it is for different countries, because that shows that there's actually concern that some countries might show more overlap and therefore potentially more impact. Now I'm going to show the same figure in a way, but right now it's what I'm showing is the licensed mining areas in black, and the 3 different shades of color around them are these spatial zones that I'm going to be talking about. We don't know how far the mining impacts will spread, so we have decided to look at 3 different spatial zones. I picked 50 kilometers because we're talking about highly mobile species that can easily transfer those distances in a day. Picked the 100-kilometer zone because this is the same width as the buffer around the areas of particular interest that Dr. Aman was talking about. These are areas to protect benthic biodiversity that have been established in Clarion-Clipperton zone. And then because we don't know for sure how far these impacts might spread, we have an extreme zone, which is the 200-kilometer zone. The data that I'm showing is made up of skipjack, yellowfin, and big-eyed tuna. More often than not, I'm showing total numbers, unless I'm saying it differently, but more often than not, I'm just showing highlights. So it's the total catch of these 3 different species. The results are also based on 2 different data sets. We use 2 different data sets to get a better idea of what the impacts might be. We have looked at data sets that consists of RFMO reports, as well as a data set that was created by Watson et al. This is a harmonized data set. It's made up of public resources, but it's mainly made up of FAO data. And the reason why we looked at both of them is that because they differ in the reporting. So they differ in what countries report to them. They differ in, for example, whether juvenile tunas are reported. And then the Watson data also applied different corrections for spatial distribution, as well as potential illegal, unregulated, unreported and unregulated catches. So there will be some varied answers in there, but overall we get some similar answers, and it will give us a more holistic idea of what the overlap might be. The overlap is based on historical data, it's average catches between 2005 and 2015. So I'm only showing the highlights. This paper is freely available online, but I can send you a copy if you like, and I think Neil is going to send also more resources later. But as a first result, I want to show that overlap is actually very location specific. So for most licensed mining areas, compared to the RFMOs that they are in, are very small. So we're talking about 2.5% or less, except for the Clarion-Clipperton zone. Clarion-Clipperton zone shows a variation between 3 and 11%. And this kind of variation is really dependent on how far the impacts of the deep sea mining will spread. So if we're still looking at Clarion-Clipperton zone, we can see that indeed the 50 kilometer has a smaller impact overlap than the 200 kilometer, which shows a much larger overlap. But if we look at the light blue one I don't know if you can see my mouse, so I'm going to say it out loud. If you look at on the right bottom, you can see that this distance impact is not always there. So in this case, we see similar levels of overlap. However, it does suggest that minimizing the spread of impacts will be beneficial to minimize potential conflict between the two industries. There is, however, an issue with country specific. And it's what we see if we're looking at countries, we start to see that some countries will show a much larger overlap in the catches that are obtaining from licensed mining areas than others. The countries that I've listed here are countries that came up in our top 5 fishing nations based on the 50 kilometer zone. So this is not based on the whole RFMO, but looking at who fished the most in the licensed mining areas. And we can see that, for example, for some countries like Mexico, it can go up from 5 to 21%. Again, this is dependent on how far the mining impacts might spread. For other nations, such as the Philippines in purple on the left below, you can see that distance actually doesn't influence it. It will still be a moderate impact. And then for some other licensed areas, such as the upper right purple or the lower red, shows that actually that distance doesn't really impact it. These are big fishing nations. These were the ones that fished the most in these licensed mining areas. But we also looked at what countries were showing the largest overlap. And I will say that this was only really from one data set, the Watson data set. But here we saw some very high numbers of overlap from certain nations, and these were specifically small island nations or developing nations. And what was also quite apparent was that the distance effect didn't really play out. There was quite often a similar number, whether you looked at the 50 kilometer or 200 kilometer. I will say that some of these nations provide flags of convenience. We did not make an attempt to correct for this, but these data are again freely available, and we're very happy to share them with you. Now, there is one other thing that we need to consider. So there's definitely overlap between mining areas and RFMOs, and this is country specific, and we see that there's this distance impact. But obviously, deep sea mining is not the only thing that's acting on our ocean, and our oceans are changing. The last couple of decades, we've already seen changes in distributions for tunas, and here I'm presenting results from a recent paper where they actually show that it's projected that tuna distributions are going to change again. So in the top layer, we have the 2015 biomass distribution in the Pacific for the 3 different tunas of interest. And in the red circle, this is the area where the Clarion-Clipperton zone is. There are 2 different greenhouse carbon emission scenarios below. We have RCP 8.5. This is the business as usual. and then we have a slightly more optimistic scenario. The red colors indicate that there is going to be an increase in biomass. And as you can see, under both scenarios, we are expecting an increase in tuna biomass for all 3 species in the next couple of decades. So that would suggest that there's potential for even greater overlap between the 2 industries. And whether this I didn't look into whether this is going to be affecting certain countries more or less, but it is definitely something to be aware of and to act on for the future. Now, there's one thing that we do need to be aware of, and that is that these impacts, this noise pollution, the suspended sediment, are not going to be uniformly distributed in space. Therefore, the impacts of fisheries are also not going to be uniformly distributed in space. But this kind of highlights again that we still need to do a lot more research to understand the potential overlap and conflict between these 2 industries. What is definitely for certain is that it is possible to minimize impact to a certain extent, like for example with the discharge plume. But noise pollution is going to be a lot more difficult. And because of these things, it's very important that fisheries are going to be considered during the deep sea mining regulation negotiations that are currently going on. Dr. Ahmad just said that there is a deadline because of the triggering of Article 15, but it's not too late to get involved. So that's what I kind of want to leave you on with the last kind of thoughts. High seas fisheries are a stakeholder in this deep sea mining debate, and they should be aware that there is a potential for conflict because of the spatial overlap that is happening already now that might actually increase in the future, and it could potentially result in reduced fisheries catches. High seas fisheries are stakeholders of the blue economy and therefore need to be considered in this debate of deep seabed mining so that we understand what the trade-offs are of this new industry. It might be difficult to understand how you can get involved in this debate, so I just put out 2 different thoughts. You can raise concerns via the participation of the ISA Council meetings. RFMOs might be able to get an observer status and directly participate in these council meetings. But of course, there are different, as Dr. Amon showed, there are different ways where nations can get involved, either through the council or the assembly. So talking to representatives of your country or nation can be very valuable in that case. There's one other thing as well. We are not sure what this year is going to bring regarding this deadline that we have, but it is possible that we will start to see the first applications for commercial mining licenses. This will have to go through consultation. So the environmental impact assessments that they will be presenting as part of this application will be up for consultation. And this is also a point where these kind of issues and concerns can be raised. On that note, I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the Ocean Benioff Laboratory for hosting this webinar. And I want to thank Jeff Drayson and Phoebe Woodworth, Jeff Coates, who have been really supportive and important in developing the work that I have been presented. And Benioff Ocean Initiative has funded this work. Thank you.
Dr. Van de Griet, thank you. Very grateful for that very clear summary. And I know there'll be interest in the paper. And so certainly we can put together a package of different publications that have been mentioned at different points here by some of our speakers and share those afterwards with those that have interest. May I propose that we dive directly into our Q&A, and Dr. Amen, if I may call on you, I'd be grateful if you wouldn't mind taking over duties of moderating the Q&A, please.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for the questions that have come in. So in addition to the experts that you've already heard from today, we're actually joined with 3 more for the Q&A section. The first is Dr. Alina Jekyll, who's an associate professor at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, ANCORS. She's an expert on ocean governance, specifically related to deep sea mining. We have Dr. Kamal Azmi, who is a senior research fellow also at ANCORS, and he's an expert in fisheries management, ocean sustainability and equity and human rights. And finally, but last but not least, we have Dr. Pradeep Singh, who is a fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz Center in Potsdam. This is formerly the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany. And he also specializes in ocean governance. So they may pop in depending on the questions asked. So with that, the first question that we were asked, which I'm going to throw to Elina, if that's okay, and anyone after that, please feel free to jump in. So how does the International Seabed Authority designate areas of particular environmental interest, APEIs, in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone specifically? What are the criteria that were used, and was the LTC involved in this process? Elina, would you be so kind? Thank you.
Sure, yeah, thank you. This is a really good question. So currently, we actually have no standardized process for developing these regional environmental management plans for seabed mining. So the APEIs, they're called areas of particular environmental interest, which are essentially just no mining zones. And those no mining zones, we currently don't have a process for how to develop them, but the ISA is working on such a standardized process. Now, for the no mining zones we have in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, they were actually suggested by scientists that are external to the ISA. And that occurred around 2007, I believe. There were some workshops to develop a management plan in these no mining zones for the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And the suggestion at the time was to protect around a quarter of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Now, those no mining zones were then proposed to the ISA, specifically the LTC. So yes, the LTC is involved in that process, but it took the ISA a couple of years to decide whether or not to actually designate these no mining zones. There were questions of, legal mandate and so on. But eventually they agreed. But what was interesting is that the location of some of those no mining zones were shifted because they overlapped with some existing exploration contract areas. So on the one hand, there were suggestions by the scientists as to where to place those no mining areas, but some of those had to be shifted for essentially political reasons. So I think it's a good example that for the fact that we need to have these no mining areas designated early on in the process. But also that science plays a role in the decision-making process, but that the outcome of the decisions is not always entirely science-based. It's often a compromise between science and politics. Now, there are processes underway to develop new regional environmental management plans for different regions. And the ISA is working on those, but the idea is at the moment to first establish that standardized process and these standardized criteria, and to then designate different regional environmental management plans with their new no mining zones. I'll leave it at that, and I think the scientists can probably pick up on the criteria for these no mining zones.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Elina. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit more, but just to say that particularly the areas of particular environmental interest in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, those were decided on a number of environmental factors or data, or the best available scientific data at that point. And so that was a mixture of biophysical gradients, so things like, for instance, depth, productivity, and so on. And then there was also the number of biologically unique seamounts included within each subregion in the CCZ. And finally, as Elina already alluded to, there was this issue of minimizing socioeconomic impacts as well. So quite a couple of things that went into that initial draft of the CCZ. So with that, let's move on to our second question. Jeff, I think this one we can start with you if that's okay. In regular mining, processing the rock to get the minerals is usually done with extremely powerful and harmful acids. Is that also expected to be released in the water column at about 1,000 meters, say?
No, is the short answer to that, but it requires a bit of backstory and something that we really haven't covered yet. With most of these mining situations, the surface ship that's doing the ore processing is then going to it's going to fill up with ore, and all of these mining entities will then be transferring the ore over to some sort of a transport ship where it will probably go to a land-based facility for refinement. And exactly how that's going to occur and what's going to happen is proprietary. Some of us are concerned that they are going to have to re-liquefy the ore to actually transport it from the main ship to the barge. which then is an opportunity for leakage into surface waters. Not of the acids as you're asking about, but I'm just pointing out that there is this big transfer to land that's going to occur. And there also could be land-based impacts from ore refinement. And we don't know where companies are planning to refine their ore, probably places with inexpensive energy and cheap labor. You're muted.
It was going to happen at some point. Thanks, Jeff. So next question, is it too late for RFMOs or other fisheries organizations to raise concerns about seabed mining and the potential effects on fisheries? And if not too late, how might they get involved? We heard some really great suggestions from Dr. Van de Greet already, but Alex, given the LDAC's engagement at the ISA, perhaps we could hear from you, and then also Kamal, if you wanted to jump in after, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. And
yeah, I think I want to be optimistic and say there is still some time left, so it's not too late. As they have been mentioned already before, I think one of the obvious direct doors for the RFMOs to participate could be requesting for observer status. There are currently, I think there are about, I think it was August 2022, 99 observers in ISA. So there are about 32 intergovernmental organizations. So that would be one of the, so they can present their work and they can speak. And it's actually at the council level, at least as I have experienced, a quite transparent process in the sense that they allow observers to speak publicly there. Then there is another part from the fishing organizations, in particular from the industries or from the ACs. What I have experienced is when I went for first time to the ISA Council, that time with Spain, because the EU didn't have the contracting party status, and the Spain accepted to take some of the arguments made by the AC. I was really surprised to see there was no mention whatsoever to the impact on fisheries in any of the discussions. And I think Spain, probably partly thanks to us, they start mentioning in the wording RFMOs and impact in fisheries. I'm very glad to see now that the things are evolving towards more concern about this. Also, we can mobilize indirectly with member states, as has been mentioned. So some member states take into account our comments together with geological experts or also other activities interests in their arguments. So that can be also another way. And also, let's not forget the BBNJ process, which it also affects to the protection of marine biodiversity as a whole. And there is these notions of cumulative impact assessment and seeing how we can better protect some features from all activities, not only one or two isolated. And so that's very important in terms of coordination. So that's basically my ideas, and I think there is still room, and I encourage both the fishing industries in the world or sectors and the RFMOs to be perhaps more present in the negotiations of ISA. Thank you.
Great, many thanks, Alex. Kamal, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
Oh, thanks, Steva. I might just add a couple of things, and I think really Alex has captured the sort of key points, because I'm less familiar with the ISA operations and so forth. But thinking about it from an RFMO perspective, the way I read the question actually suggested to me that the question might have actually come from someone associated with an RFMO. I'll make a couple of comments. Firstly, bouncing off Jesse's great presentation. Jesse did an analysis of fishing states who have whose vessels overlap with mining zones. I think the other angle to think about is also coastal states within whose exclusive economic zones fishing occurs, and so that often, particularly in the Western Pacific, is a lot of small island developing states who license a lot of fishing by foreign vessels in their zones. And Jeff had a great slide from Johan Bell's paper on the revenue that those states receive as a result of foreign licensing. So it's not just thinking about it in terms of fishing states, but also as exclusive economic zones. And the combination of fishing states and exclusive economic zones make up the membership of RFMOs. And when RFMOs are taking positions, they would typically do so by consensus. But within RFMO membership, there is an incredible diversity of interests, including those of coastal states and distant water fishing states, and as well states who rely more heavily on domestic fishing. And so in tuna RFMOs, there is this considerable diversity. So I think RFMOs themselves will face a challenge in forming a consensus on what position to actually take on deep sea mining. But I'm thinking for the coastal states, for instance, and this is a question for scientists, I don't know the answer to this, but where there are plumes, particularly midwater plumes, and the impact of currents on those, are they likely to affect exclusive economic zones? And the second, and the other aspect to that is also the direct interests of countries. So where you have a country like Nauru that has considerable interests in fisheries within their exclusive economic zone, with 30% or so of their government revenue comes from fisheries and foreign access fees, but is also has an interest in mining, in seabed mining. So they bring those diverse interests that are not just fisheries into the RFMO as well. Thanks.
Dr. Mann, if I can just interject very quickly. I can't add and won't add to the depth of answer that our two policy experts gave, but I wanted to just flag one much more minor point to the more complete information they shared, which is that we're aware that there'll be a side event on the subject of fisheries and interactions with seabed mining at the March meeting at the International Seabed Authority in Kingston. As more information becomes available on the timing and the content, we'll be glad to share that with anyone in the webinar who's interested in that event and the subject matter. While this conversation was a blend of policy and science, I think that conversation is more likely to be more focused on the policy elements of the conversation, so as to engage more constructively with the negotiators that are there drawing up code live at the ISA. So just simply planting the flag that there'll be more information, I believe, that is shared by concerning that side event.
Many thanks, Doug, and to Alex and to Kamal also. So we have just 3 questions remaining that have been submitted, and I recognize we're drawing close to the end. So the first one, Jeff, I'm going to throw this to you. Or actually all 3 will be thrown to you, I suspect. So the first one is, in Namibia, the proposed marine phosphate mining is on the edge of the breeding and juvenile fish nursery zone. Is there any sense of the implications of this, particularly given that uranium and heavy metals are in the sediments, as well as sediment plumes and noise pollution?
Yeah, phosphate mining is another form of ocean mining. It is typically in slightly shallower waters than the types of mining we've been focusing on this webinar, and I'm not a huge expert on phosphate mining. I don't know the particulars of the situation in Namibia, so I'm sorry, I may not be able to answer your question fully. I guess what I would say is I believe that phosphate mining is on the shelf off of Namibia, and so there are a lot of fisheries right there with a lot of direct impacts from the mining, and those sediment plumes may in fact affect those animals. I don't know about the metals that you mentioned, uranium, rare earths in the muds that may be on those shelves. I don't know if those are making their way into commercially harvested species there. I don't know the science. So sorry, a fairly incomplete answer. A lot of the same problems that occur in the deeper mining, but I don't know the specifics off of Namibia. I'm sorry.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Stay right there because the last 2 questions are for you. So it's interesting that most of the studies have focused on the impacts of deep sea mining on pelagic species such as tuna. Do you know anything about the impacts on benthic deep sea fish stocks?
Yeah, I think a lot of focus has been on pelagic species because of the fiscal importance of tuna fisheries and also the cultural importance in a number of nations. But deep seamount fisheries are also likely going to be affected to, depending on where those occur. The seamounts are often fished down to depths of 1,000 meters, a little bit more, maybe down to 1,500 meters, and a number of seamounts that do have harvestable fish stocks on them, such as Alfonsinos and Orange Ruffy, are in areas of mining interest for their cobalt crusts. So there is going to be some intersection there, and mining on seamount summits are quite small. And so there's a lot less sediment in many of these systems. So we might expect that the sediment clouds would be less on seamount mining, but the habitat's a whole lot smaller. And so I think there's a much greater potential for direct impacts on those kinds of fisheries in contrast to things like tuna or swordfish fisheries, for instance.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And so our final question before we wrap up. How do we interpret studies that say that plumes remain relatively low and stay within 2 meters of the seafloor after disturbance? Could you talk a bit more about what the latest research is saying about how far plumes potentially will spread?
Yeah, that's the collector plume down on the seafloor, and GSR did some very good monitoring of their collector test vehicle. I think it's called the Botania 2 last year. And with their sensors, I think they saw sediment rise up to about 3 to 5 meters. A lot of it stayed a bit lower. So that is good news. And we hope that they can design a full-scale vehicle that will also keep those sediment clouds low. But I will say that those experiments were quite short-term, and they are not full-scale industrial mining. So we do have to assume that the real mining plumes will be larger. Those are collector plumes. The mid-water plumes that we think may affect fisheries, that's just discharge out of a pipe. And the best modeling studies suggest that those will be several hundred meters thick. So it's very different than the collector plumes on the seafloor.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And now over to you, Doug. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jason. Thank you, Dr. Mann. And not too far off in terms of our timing. So I'll be very brief to bring this to our close because we are at the half hour. Simply to say again, thanks to all of you for your attendance. Thank you especially to our participants, or to our participants on the panel, for sharing expertise and sharing your science and sharing your deep bench of knowledge on policy as well. I hope that the conversation here has begun to shed some light on some of the questions that we opened with, address some of the questions that you shared today, and also help to define some of the boundaries, what we know and certainly what we don't yet know about interactions here between fisheries and seabed mining. Some of the unknown is also incredibly important, and appreciate some of our colleagues highlighting some of those frontiers for new research. I appreciate the underlining of the time sensitivity of the conversation. Of course, has mentioned by multiple different panelists, it is a question of great urgency to engage or to understand the development of this code and policy is what will be shaped in March and at the ISA, and July, and the ISA may well begin to set a canalized trajectory towards determining how this industry will begin for next decades or centuries ahead. So it's certainly timely to have all of the experts weigh in and all of your participation. I appreciate the direction also from our panelists about how to engage, some excellent recommendations. And if you have any further questions, I'll be so bold as to say that our panelists, and some have said as much overtly in the chat, would be willing to field additional questions afterwards. If you have questions that are not germane to the expertise of the panelists that joined us today, we can continue to provide a bit of a Bureau Secretariat function for routing those questions to other researchers in the deep sea community or beyond, where you may find an appropriate answer for your questions. So please let us know how we continue to be a service for the conversation. I would flag that we do quite often host, or at least occasionally host, conversations about fisheries, about ocean health in the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory. Would be grateful for those that are interested. We can keep you on our call list for future conversations of this type. So thank you again all for your time, and I wish you all a good day.